Hello, travelers. This episode is going to start out on a sad note. So if you're not looking to get sad, skip forward a little bit. But last night, I was working on some travel stuff. My kiddo has been going to bed super late, and I also needed to, start getting myself ready for bed. And before I went upstairs to do that, I got an email from the head of my host agency letting us know that a fellow agent of mine who I've traveled with, I talk with at conferences, that he's just a good guy, good agent. He's really fun to talk to, and, we love to talk travel. We did a fam trip together, and we, talked about families and our kids and all of that stuff. And she let us know that his youngest child passed away over the weekend. And I don't know why that one hit me really hard last night. And I don't know what happened. I don't know the specifics, but my heart just breaks for him and his wife and his oldest. And just, I don't know how anyone can navigate that. And so last night, I'm have that kind of in the back of my head, and my daughter's finally starting to settle down, and we're finally getting settled into bed and listening to our little story that we listen to before bedtime. And she's still kind of restless. She's asking for water. She's kind of like playing with her blankets and stuff. And then she puts her arm up in the air, and I'm like, it's time for bed. Like it's time to close her eyes. And she's like, Mommy, I just want a hug. And so then I just lost it. And I probably hugged her too tight, but I feel like that's not possible. And so I'm feeling very blessed to have my kiddo with me, and that I can see her when I go home tonight. And so this is just a reminder to all of us to tell your loved ones, tell your friends, tell your family that you love them, and don't be afraid to tell them that. And that, our time is fleeting, and you never know what's going to happen the next day. So sorry to be such a downer to start out this episode, but it's just what's on my mind. And, it's just so hard to navigate all of that. Hello, travelers. Welcome to Life Between Flights, the podcast about travel industry, small business, and all of the interruptions in between. My name is Cecily North Rudo. I'm a certified travel advisor and owner of Traveling North Travel Agency. Today, we're going to be talking about leadership and how that's different than management, and just a little bit of my experience leading in various things, because when you're owning your own business, whether that's as a travel advisor or something else, obviously leading is a big part of that, and knowing when you need help in it, and knowing just where you need that support, and getting people on board with you. And this is going to lead to the next episode after this one, where I talk with a good friend of mine who is a leadership coach, and we are going to have a wonderful conversation about leadership and life and how it all kind of comes together, and just experiences and kind of what led her into her business. And so today I just wanted to talk about leadership in different forms. Like, I think a lot of people look at leadership, especially in a corporate setting, either you're the person that wants to go up the management chain and you want to kind of get to the top. Maybe you want to be, CEO or vice president or whatever, a director of some kind. And there's that kind of like mindset around that very formal, organized structure of leadership. And then there's a very informal version of leadership. And, I've never held a official management position. I have served in an interim management position for a very short term in my library world, but really my leadership skills are, I kind of lead from where I'm at, which I think is more important, especially when you are, when you're the entrepreneur and you are the leader and you are in charge of your team, or if it's just you, how do you stay motivated? How do you set your goals? How do you manage your finances? How are you running your business? And that's, when it's your business, you get to decide all of that. But there are things where you might need help in some areas, or you need some support in some way. And so I just wanted to talk about kind of my experiences, because all of this is kind of transferable skills, especially when you take on either a volunteer leadership position, or if you're, say you're in a position where you're not a manager, but you are having to lead a team or having to work within a team. And also just like, maybe you don't have an official title, or maybe you're not the head of a team, but you're participating in a team. Because I think most of us have been part of a team or a project where there is a leader, and maybe the leader isn't all that great at what they do. They're not so great in the leadership skills, or maybe they're just there for the wrong reasons. And so I think that's something to think about. There are so many books out there, which I will link some of them in the show notes, of leadership books that I have read in my time. And a lot of them were, recommendations from our HR departments and all of my different jobs. They all kind of overlap in some way, but there's just so many different skills that we kind of develop, I think, over time, when whether you're in corporate or whether you're, independent and you're working for yourself. But it's kind of that lead where you're at position. And so one of the first, I think a lot of us, like I did theater in high school, and I did behind the scenes stuff. I was on the tech side, and I painted the sets. That's what I did. That's what I was known for. And I did that for most of our shows throughout my high school career. And, it was kind of fun as I got into like junior and senior year, where I actually got to help like with the design of what the sets were like, what the painting was going to look like, and having sort of ownership over that, which was really, really fun. And it was kind of cool to just be part of that. And that's kind of the first time that I can remember thinking about, like, there were days where we would have work days where the whole cast and crew would come in and we'd be working on stuff for, a big musical or something, and having to know like what projects needed to be done that day, and instructing people and giving people the tools and the like literal tools, but in addition to that, like, what do they need to accomplish what we needed to get done that day. And especially when it's high school kids that are all distracted, it's hard to wrangle that. Even when you're a high schooler and you're in that, but there are so many experiences like that in high school, whether you're in theater or maybe you're in sports or you're in speech or you're doing 4-H or whatever. There's so many opportunities to take on a leadership role even at that young age. And then going into college, I kind of left that world to do other things, but then I was just kind of on my own in college. I had a very different college experience than most people, and so I was on my own in a different state. I didn't have any friends, I didn't have any family, and so I was just kind of, I worked and I went to school, and that was what I did. But again, you're like, I really had to learn self-direction, and just being, I had to make sure I was getting all of my work in and getting everything done. Plus going to work, I was like a third key. So it's like, you're running a store by yourself. You might have someone taking over for you, or you're taking over for someone else at night. But like, you're having to follow the store policies, and you're having to, do reports and run money to the bank and all of that stuff. So it's like, there's a lot to do there. Your management is relying on you to do all of that without any direction. And so, and all of us that have worked retail or food service or whatever growing up, like, you kind of see, I think that's kind of those leadership things that impact you over time, especially like, your first job or two, and you start to see these different kind of leadership styles. And then after college, I did an internship, which was very, it was a lot of hand holding. It was a lot of like, this is what you're going to do today and all of that stuff. But then when I came back home, and then I was working, I temped for a while. And so it was, you're in a different office every single day, and you're meeting different people, and you're not really connecting with any sort of substance. But then once I got my first real, not salary, but real, full-time job as an adult at the library, and our department was moved around twice in my 7 years there. We were under one person, and then they moved us to be under a different department. And so just seeing different management styles, and also seeing people in those leadership positions that truly, there were some that truly did not care about the person and did not care about, they just wanted to see things getting done, and they didn't really care about how the things got done. And they didn't really care if employees were stepping on other employees' toes or hurting feelings or whatever. But then, when we got moved and we got put under a different manager, there was like different conflicts, and everybody's personalities, different generations and all of that stuff. But I think there's a real skill in just understanding emotional intelligence and understanding how different generations work together and how different people work together and all of those different personalities. And, my library district really focused on, it's required coursework that you take with other of your colleagues. So you get to know these different personalities and you get to know these different types. And I think that's a really important thing to know about yourself. And, those are the things to think about when you're starting a business. And especially if you're going to start expanding, let's say you're going to need to hire your first employee, or you need to hire an assistant, or you need to hire someone to help you with your team, or maybe you have to hire a consultant to work with you, or a contractor. It's maybe only doing a portion, but you really need to think about your leadership style, how you communicate, how they communicate, what are your expectations. And that's something, that we all need to understand and do regardless of what your title is. I had been with the library for 3 years when they started a leadership program, and so it was an application process, and there were 10 people chosen, and the first year was going to be all about learning skills to help in leadership, and then the second year was project work. And so there were 10 of us that were selected. I was lucky enough to be selected in that, and the coursework around that was, time management, and we had to take crucial conversations, and we had to take an emotional intelligence class. And we took some other sort of outside classes, like we had outside facilitators come in. We did like a personality training. We did some other things about like core values and just kind of stuff specifically for our library, which was, I think, a really interesting way to see the organization from a different side. And I think that's something that can get lost with bigger corporations and bigger organizations when you've got hundreds of employees. Some of those things can kind of get lost, the core values and kind of processes. And I think too, with bigger organizations and corporations and things with, places with hundreds of employees, those employees that are kind of down in those lower levels can sometimes get lost, maybe even in middle management, and there's the real high up managers or leaders, can they're off doing lots of things. And I think it's hard sometimes to recognize everybody that's below you. Right now I'm part of a division with almost 50 people in it. And we meet quarterly where we all meet in one room, and it keeps getting, more and more crowded because there's more of us. But it's really exciting to see that. And it's really nice to have someone from, the director level all the way down to our entry level brand new people coming in, and we all meet, and we all get to talk about what's happening in our division and kind of what's happening in our district at a bigger level. And that's one of the things that you have to think about too as a leader is like, how transparent are you going to be? Obviously transparency is better, because if you're hiding things, people aren't going to want to work for you. Or you're leading the example of hiding things, which means your employees could potentially be hiding things as well, which is also not a way to run a business. But I think there's just, there's so many different ways to lead. And so, with this leadership program that I did, once we got into the second year and we were doing this project-based work, all of us, the first project I worked on, there was just 2 of us, and it was a friend of mine, a very good friend of mine, who did want to grow in her jobs and her skills and, move up from where she was into management and into directorship and all of that stuff. And she's very passionate about it and has been passionate about it since those days 20 years ago almost. And now she's at that level. She's at the director level. For me, I really just saw it as, I wanted to get to the position that I'm at now, which wasn't a huge jump, but, I'm happy where I'm at. I don't aspire to be anything more than where I'm at in my current job. Like, I want to continue to do the best work at where I'm at. And that's, I think that's okay for people too. And that leadership program, the second project I did was a different program. It was with a department that I don't work with. And at the time, it was doing some things around story time and storytelling and working with our children's librarians. And at the time, I was engaged to my first husband. We got married in the time that I was part of this leadership thing, but I had no thought that I would even have kids. So it was kind of I wanted to help because it involved some web development and some storytelling and things like that. And it was a really, really fun project. And I learned a whole lot because it was so outside of what I do on a daily basis. And I think there's something to be said for that too in leadership, is that you want to make sure that you can do the skills required of, the people that you're asking to. Now, of course, like in your own business, when you're creating it and you're creating these job descriptions, if you are hiring people, then yes, you should absolutely know, what all of the different positions are, or at least be hiring the people that are in that management level that can help. And, I talk to business owners all the time that have a hard time hiring people, and they'll hire someone and they'll leave, and they'll hire someone else and then they'll leave. And it's sometimes hard to retain people. And I will be bringing on another friend of mine who helps with that kind of stuff, with hiring and hiring the right people for the position, and hiring based on skills and based on experience and interest in what you're doing. And I think that's a huge thing too. I love what I do in both the library world and obviously in the travel world. I am passionate about both. And, today I got to do some tours of our archives and our vault, and that lights me up just as much as working on a new trip for someone. They are both what I'm passionate about and what I love doing and what I love talking about. So, finding those things that lights you up, that's why we all start our own business, right? It's the stuff that makes us excited to wake up in the morning and to start the day and go out there and do what we love to do. I will also say with leadership, leadership is what's going to make or break people staying with you. And that is one thing that I have found in my career, going from, my library job, and then when I switched from archives into administration, and then from administration, then I went to work for another organization for a year. And that one I was really, really excited about. But it was a really hard time, I think, for the organization. It was, I liked everyone that I worked with, but there was a whole lot of turnover in the year that I was there. I mean, I left within a year, and usually, up to that point, unless it was a temp job, I would stay at a job for as long as I could. I didn't want to bounce around, but after a year, I just felt like I just couldn't do anything right. And I've had 2 supervisors in my life tell me that I should be able to read their minds. And unfortunately, that's just not a skill that I have. And that's something that also speaks to leadership. And that's what I think more the management side of it, right? That's the more, person-to-person contact when someone tells you that. And it really just makes you feel like you can't do anything right. And I think that there's just different ways to go about that. And in that job, there were tasks that I was asked to do, and then my boss would redo them because I didn't do it her way. And there's absolutely, some understanding of that at some point. But when it's something that I have done for years, and it was something that the rest of the staff had no problem with, and that I had been tasked to do, and it was the understanding of everyone in the building that I was going to be doing this task, and then for her to come back and completely redo it and show it to everyone in a staff meeting, there's better ways to go about that. And so, looking back on the managers that I have worked for and seeing leadership, I think is much more, it doesn't matter what your title is, you are following your core values, you are leading from wherever you're at, and you're really wanting to connect with people, and you're trying to make sure that everyone has the skills that they need and the tools that they need to do their job and to be successful. And if they're not being successful, you're not going to, there's some level of everyone, I need to take accountability for my own stuff, which is totally understandable. But when I know that I myself am doing a good job, and it's something that I'm skilled at and I have experience in, and someone else says, nope, this is terrible, then there has to be some sort of discussion about that. It's not worth a fight necessarily, but it's definitely like I didn't know how to respond in that situation because I knew I had done everything. It was literally a formatting issue. I had done it in one way, and she wanted it to look a different way, and it's like, that was a discussion that could have been done privately and not in a staff meeting. And I think that's where some leadership training for leaders is actually useful outside of crucial conversations, but just being like, hey, when you give someone a project, and if they're not doing it the way that you want them to, then maybe before you redo it all, you have a discussion with them. And then if they can't follow directions or whatever, then that's fine. The other thing I will say, comparing that experience to maybe a year or two later, I started working for a big retail chain, and I was actually the administrative assistant, and I was doing the exact same tasks that I had been told I was doing incorrectly in the old position. And I was doing it in a much bigger scale, in a much more important way. Like it was having to do with schedules. And so I truly became known throughout the district because of how efficient I was at creating these schedules that would take others, days to do. And it's like, well, I was just very efficient at it, and I knew my systems, and I knew what I was working with that would help me to make my systems go faster. And it's just funny to see I was doing literally the same thing in a different position, and I was being told that I was doing it incorrectly for literally a weekend for 12 people, to then be doing it for 100 up to 150 people in a store setting where we were open. It was during the holidays, so it's like, we're open almost 24 hours a day for several weeks between Thanksgiving and Christmas. And so it's just funny to see how people respond to you. And in the retail job, I had a manager who absolutely trusted me to get my job done. She absolutely was like, we rarely saw each other because we had such opposite schedules, and she just trusted me. She knew that I would get it done, and I would get it done early. And she would make her corrections, managers having to move or whatever. But generally, she would be like, yep, this is great. Let's publish it. Let's get it up on the board. And then people, of course, can make changes on their own and trade and whatever. But, having someone like that was willing to not just approve of what I was doing and tell me that I was doing a good job and trusting me was such a difference. And it's so funny because people are like, well, retail is retail. And it's like, yeah, but that manager made me feel like $1 million compared to a higher education setting where I was made to feel like I was doing everything wrong, and that not that I wasn't important to the organization, but just I wasn't doing everything that I should have been doing, whatever that means. And so it's just funny to see manager to manager, and regardless of title, just how you take care of your people and how you supervise people and having conversations with them. That's been my experience with leadership. And now, since then, I've had amazing supervisors and people that, again, trust me to get my job done because they have other things to do. And that's the thing as a leader, when you're hiring or your managers are hiring, you want to make sure that they're hiring the best people for that position, that you can trust them to get their job done. They're going to get it done on time. They're going to get it done under budget, whatever your expectations are. I think that's a huge thing. Another source of leadership experience for me is I have served on several boards in my time, all professional development for my library work, either in archives or in a museum setting. And again, I've been board president, I've been vice president, I've been, director of, name it, and I've done it. And there's just a certain level. I'm always, when people are talking about especially getting into the library world, but this is true for a lot of industries, especially for people that are either just out of college, maybe they haven't started a master's program yet, or maybe they have gotten their library degree, but they're just like, hey, I'm applying for all of these jobs, but I'm not getting called back, or I'm not actively doing anything. And I always tell people, are you volunteering? Are you serving in a professional capacity? Are you doing anything that's going to keep your skills relevant? That, for all of us that serve on boards, especially in these really small, the Archive Society that I'm part of, that I have been a member of for off and on for 20 years now. And I've served on the board for a good 10 years, more than that now. Probably 12 years of that time in some capacity or another. I tell people all the time, especially if you're coming out of a degree program, find your professional association and volunteer, nominate yourself to serve on a board, because I can guarantee they're desperate for board members. You're going to create a network of professionals that are in the industry, that have been in the industry, and they can help you. They can help you with your skills. They can help you with your resume. There's going to be project work that you can work on to help keep your skills fresh. Serve on a board. Get to know people in your industry, because that's going to be a huge piece. And also, if they see that you're willing to take on a leadership role, that always looks good on a resume and always looks good for support. And you get to talk about this project work. And, when you're interviewing for jobs and they see that you're working on a scholarship committee, or you're writing things for the newsletter. I know, especially in academia where you have to be publishing all the time, it's a great way to do that, is getting involved in the newsletter. There's just so many different ways to lead. And yes, they are volunteer positions, so it does require you having the time. But for us, we meet virtually. We meet once a year for the annual conference. I think a lot of people kind of get overwhelmed with the thought of serving on a board. Of course, some are way more involved than we are, but there are some that aren't. And especially if you're looking for that experience and you're looking for a network, join your local industry-specific association, society, whatever they call it. And even if maybe they don't have board position open at the time, but they're going to have elections at some point. And, you can join, especially if you're in school, you can join at a student rate usually, which is cheaper. It gets you a discount to attend to conferences or educational, professional development, things like that. And it just helps, and I will do a whole episode on professional development. But, those are those places where you can lead and it looks good on a resume because you are helping to further the profession. And you're keeping your skills sharp and you're helping others in the industry. And it's just such a great way to kind of kill two birds with one stone in that you're getting that experience, but you're also helping the profession and you're networking, and you never know where that next job is going to come from, because not all jobs get posted on Indeed. So that's another part of it. A huge part for me is serving on these boards. And, especially when we have our annual conference, and last year I was president and we had a really, really successful conference. And I was really, really proud of that and proud of my conference team for putting that together, because it was a lot of work and it was a lot of coming out of COVID and having an in-person conference and having it sell out. We had a wait list. It's pretty astounding for a small association. So look for those opportunities where you can lead, where you can volunteer. Our local Chamber of Commerce just had elections for their new board. There's so many places to volunteer your time and your skills. And especially as a small business owner, there's so many places where you can share your knowledge and do it in a way that's not, in a professional, managing people, but you're definitely leading. And when you're out presenting and you're helping people, whether it's a project or serving on a board, or maybe, here in our county, we do tours for teachers, and it's helping introduce teachers to opportunities for students that maybe aren't going to take the 4-year college route. Maybe they're going to do something else, and it's kind of introducing them to careers that allow for that. But there's just so many ways to go about in that leadership role without having, the real management or real leadership title. Now, to translate that into where I'm at with my travel business, a lot of those skills that I've learned over the years, and I've seen from managers, and I've learned from talking to so many people, and I'm always looking to talk to other business owners, and maybe those that maybe they have a handful of employees, or maybe they have a couple contractors, or I know several people that are consultants, so they have clients that are all over the country. And it's well, how do you work with all of them, and how do you manage that, and how do you manage expectations? How do you set your goals? How do you celebrate your wins? And when you set those goals and you've accomplished them, how do you celebrate all of that? And we're going to talk about, celebrating the wins in another episode. But really today, I really admire people in leadership positions and that are willing to talk with their team, talk with their staff, and really that they're leading from a place of wanting to support everyone and wanting to have everyone give their input and feel valued. And I think that's why a lot of us go into our own business, is because we, obviously know what we're doing, and we want to be successful at that, but also, valuing our time and our experience and our expertise and all of those things. That's what I tell people when I go to my networking meetings and we're talking about who's the ideal client. And for me, my ideal client is someone who values my expertise and my experience and my network in the travel industry. And that's something that, not everybody does. When I talk to other business owners, it's that value piece that we talk about all the time. And what is your value for your clients? What is your value to the industry? That's definitely something that when people see your value and they see that you are worth your fees, you're worth your whatever your package is, that it's not just necessarily connected to money. It's just they see all of the things that you provide and all of the things that you do because you love it and you're passionate about it. And that's truly, I think, the leadership part of it comes from, you want to see people succeed. You want to succeed. You want to succeed as a group. And you can do that from wherever you're at. You don't have to be a manager. You don't have to be a director. You just want to make sure that everyone is successful and that they are doing the best to their ability. A good friend of mine used to say all the time, she's like, no one comes to work wanting to do a bad job. I think about that a lot. Like, I have no intention of going to work every day or working on a trip and not doing my job for the day or not doing what I have to get done that day. I never have the intention of, I'm going to plan a really bad trip. I'm going to plan the exact opposite of what they asked for. That just isn't how I do things. Yeah, the leadership stuff, I will link to some of my favorite leadership books in the show notes. There's so many out there, and I think it really is just finding the ones that really speak to you, because there's just so many different ways to approach, and every industry is different, and just how we all deal with our responsibilities in our business and how we want our business to run and how we want to be leaders. So stay tuned. Next week, we are going to be talking to Chris Wilson-Slack, owner of Managers to Leaders, and we're going to be talking about her business and thoughts on leadership and what she does, and we're just going to have a really, really great conversation about all of those things. And with that, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week, safe travels, and may your luggage follow you wherever you go. Today's episode of Life Between Flights was sponsored by me, Traveling North, produced by me and edited by Nomad Creations. Please check out the show notes for referral links, discount codes, and more resources that I've talked about in this episode. You can also follow along on our social media on Facebook and Instagram at Life Between Flights Pod. If you want help planning your next adventure, you can always check me out at travelingnorthagency.com. If you have any questions, ideas, or would like to sponsor this podcast, you can email us at lifebetweenflightspod@gmail.com.